So good morning, everybody. And today we're going to finish off our discussion about the nervous system. And we're going to be talking, we've been talked extensively now about the brain and brain structure. And we're going to move on to seeing how the brain actually communicates with the rest of the body. Only in simple terms. It's actually a very complex topic, but we'll keep it easily understandable. Just to remind you, this is the structure of the brain that we've seen already. And first of all, let's remember that right in the center of the brain, there is the part of the brain we often refer to as being the primitive brain. Really, it's not that primitive, but the thing is that a lot of its function is instinctual function. It's not a function which comes under any voluntary control. So this whole of the central part of the brain, lying here and down to there, is the part of the brain which communicates between the rest of the brain and then the spinal cord, which is what we're going to be talking about extensively today. Just to remind you that we saw several important parts to that primitive kind of area of the brain. And this is what we refer to as the brain stem here, consisting of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and then the midbrain. And if you look through, I'm not going to run through them all again, but if you look through the functions of these, you'll see that they control many of the unconscious areas of functioning. So we don't exert any conscious control over them. These things proceed without our knowing it. A lot of that because of processing that takes place here in this part of the brain. I want you don't need to remember it now for them, but I'm going to refer again. You see these here, you see these nerves leaving here. These are what we refer to as cranial nerves. And they're nerves which arise directly from the brain. And many of the functionings of this area here is due to the presence of these cranial nerves. They operate extensively in the unconscious functioning of the body. The other responsibility of this primitive area of the brain here is relaying, is actually shunting information to the correct places in the higher brain. And you see this here. This is a huge tract of nerves which has been cut across. This is a tract of nerves, obviously repeated on the other side here, which communicate now with the cerebral hemispheres, where most of the conscious processing of information, that sort of thing, takes place. With the cerebral hemispheres, where our sense of consciousness lies, but don't forget that there are many unconscious functions which are also controlled by the cerebral hemispheres. So here's the part that we referred to before as the diencephalon. I'm reminding you about this because we will refer to this again when we talk about endocrine function, because here in the thalamus and the hypothalamus, here lie many of the controls over the endocrine system. So all of this you're beginning to realize all of this functioning here, very intimately involved with unconscious control of essential functions, breathing, heart rate, sense of thirst, all of that sort of thing. All of these are controlled here in this section of the brain. So this midbrain stem then links the brain to the spinal cord itself. Let's have a look and see what the spinal cord looks like. The spinal cord is essentially an extension of the brain. It's like a long piece of the brain extending down through the spine, and in fact, its structure reflects that. For example, the nerves that compose the spinal cord are surrounded by the same membranes that the brain is surrounded by. They're surrounded by the meninges. There's again 3 of them around the spinal cord, just as there are around the brain, and they are fluid filled. In addition, remember that the brain is hollow. The brain has those hemispheres inside it that are full of cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal cord is also hollow. It has a narrow canal running all the way through it, again filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So that's the spinal cord. Now, we've got to find some way for the body, for the whole of the rest of the body, to communicate now with the spinal cord, with the central nervous system, with the spinal cord, and then ultimately with the brain. And that is done through a set of nerves which form what we refer to as being the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is composed of all of those nerves which are not in the central nervous system. They communicate to the central nervous system. The first thing we'll notice when we take a look at the spine is that, first of all, let's orient ourselves again. There's the brain stem, and then the brain would be, the cerebral hemispheres would be above it. Here is the spinal cord running through the spine. Okay, each vertebra has a canal there, which the spinal cord runs through. So the spinal cord is sort of oval shaped, it's flattened from side to side, like that, runs through that canal. Here's the vertebra. Remember, the vertebra is an irregular bone. It has a big articulating surface there for it to articulate with the next vertebra, so that we have a certain amount of rotational movement like that. But we can also bend forward and we can bend back, although the movement of the vertebra is limited to protect the spinal cord. The spinal cord is extremely delicate and extremely important. So here's the spinal cord here, and the first thing you'll notice is the huge nerves entering and leaving the spinal cord. And they enter and leave as huge tracts of nerves. This here, that side there, those are nerves which are bringing information to the central nervous system from the rest of the body. So we call those the afferent nerves, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, afferent nerves. They run to the central nervous system, and they are carrying information from the rest of the body. They're carrying sensory information. That's why they're referred to as being the sensory nerves. That sensory information is not necessarily senses that we are aware of. It may be things like pain or heat or whatever, but it can also be physiological information. It can be information which is being sent to those areas of the brainstem, for example, which regulates homeostasis, so that if something is out of whack, the information is sent to the brainstem and the body can adjust to bring conditions back to optimal conditions. And that's what we call homeostasis, maintaining optimal conditions as closely as possible. All of that kind of information is being sent up through these nerves, then up to the brain, to the various areas of the brain for analysis. This part of the spinal cord here is distinctly paler, and it's often called the white matter. And that is because this is composed of nerves which are myelinated. You'll remember the nerves, many nerves have an insulating layer around them of lipids, of cells which are filled with a lipid called myelin. So many of these here are myelinated, and they are nerves which are running to communicate between the central nervous system and the body. So there may be nerves running up to the brain and nerves running down as well. This gray area here is mostly composed of cell bodies of the nerves, of the neurons. And also there are many nerves here which compose reflexes, which I'll talk about at the end of this chapter. So when you look at this white matter here, you can visualize nerves running up and down to and from the brain. The sensory nerves sending information to the central nervous system. the central nervous system is then sending instructions back and down and out to the rest of the body. This tract of nerves here is called the motor route. This here is called the sensory route. The motor route, that word motor there is a little bit deceptive because it implies that that is something to do with movement. Well, it can be, because this is the way in which the brain will send a message to your arm to say contract or do this or open your hand to do whatever. But the motor impulses may also be, for example, to glands or something like this, something completely unconscious. It's still a motor impulse, which is being sent by the brain, because it produces a result. It's an impulse which is going to result in the body undertaking some action. Maybe movement, but it might also be the release of a substance from a gland, for example. So this is what you need to remember: the sensory route of nerves, motor route. This is afferent. This is efferent. I will just say this is not exclusive, by the way. These are not, this route here is not exclusively sensory. There is some mix up. There may be some motor nerves here as well, and there may be some sensory nerves here, but they are by and large, this is the motor route, and this is the sensory route here. Just visualize this information is coming in from the body, being sent up to the brain, maybe to one of those, maybe to the brain stem. Maybe that's where it's going to be processed. When it gets to the thalamus and those areas, maybe it's going to be, the information needs to be shunted off to a conscious area of the brain. That primitive area of the brain does a lot of that relaying. It does some processing and everything of its own to maintain homeostasis, but it may also be relaying information to the correct areas of the brain as it arrives from the spinal cord. Okay, so don't freak out at this diagram. I'll do it simply for you. This is really just to impress you, okay? Because I just want you to notice that there are 31 pairs. Get that into your consciousness already. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So these are the spinal nerves, okay? Those are the spinal nerves leaving the spinal cord. And here they are here. You can see this tract here. Just look at this one here. You see them there, leaving. This is the spinal cord here. There they are leaving. This tract here is this here. Is that sensory route, okay? And you can see how they pass between the vertebrae out and now out to the body. So I'd rather say these are coming from the body up to the spinal cord. If we were able to see on the other side here, we'd see the motor complexes running off that way to the body. Once they've left, they spread out in a huge net throughout the body. That is the first component of the peripheral nervous system. Is these spinal nerves coming from the body to the spine, and from the spine to the body, form a great network of nerves all the way through your body. But they are not the only nerves. So just to give you a simpler version of them, here you'll see there are 8 cervical spinal nerves, or cervical, it doesn't matter what you say, there. 12 thoracic spinal nerves, there. 5 lumbar, there. And 5 sacral. So the sacral, that's in the pelvis. Those originate from the spine that forms the sacrum. Lumbar, that's in the small of your back, the 5 lumbar. Thoracic, that's your chest, 12 thoracic spinal nerves, and then 8 cervical spinal nerves of the neck. These correspond, the number corresponds more or less to the number of vertebrae in each of those regions. If you go back, you'll remember it not exactly, but more or less it corresponds to the number of vertebrae. If you count them up, 8, 12, 20, 5, 25, 5, 30. Where's the other one? The other one is the last pair of nerves that comes off here, called the coccygeal nerves. There's the name for you there. So that gives you 31. The 30 together there, and then the one coccygeal nerve gives you the 31st pair of spinal nerves. And you can see from this diagram how they spread out, but this is simplified because they'll branch into many, many, many hundreds of thousands of sub-branches going to and coming from the tissues of the body. Now, the spinal nerves are only one part of the peripheral nervous system. There is another part of the peripheral nervous system, which are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Now, these are nerves which arise directly from the brain, and many of them do not pass through the spinal cord. Many of them, for example, have a look here, and you'll see. I'll tell you in a minute exactly what I want you to remember. For the moment, I just want you to notice something. Many, many, many of these nerves are arising from that primitive area of the brain stem, that kind of area of the brain gives rise to many of these cranial nerves. And you'll see that a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them function at the head. They are nerves which govern the actions of the eye, for example, the eye muscles, the reflex, opening and shutting of the iris of the eye, that sort of thing. It's cranial nerves which are responsible for your sense of hearing and your sense of balance as well. So many of them, many of them have functions which lie around the head. So they communicate directly from the brain to the head. But there are some of the cranial nerves which do communicate with the rest of the body and are very, very important. So the one that I want you to remember for the moment is the vagus nerve there. So the vagus nerve has many, many functions in the body, and they are functions for all functions which are unconscious. The vagus nerve receives information and sends information which regulates the beating of the heart, for example. It governs the functioning of your diaphragm. It governs the blood pressure. Many, many, many of these functions are a result of vagus nerve activity. So the vagus is one that you do need to remember. It's a very, very important nerve. The other cranial nerves that I want you to remember are the ones that are associated with the senses. For example, of the olfactory nerve, that is the sense of smell. The optic nerve, the sense of sight. The two nerves of the ear, they're together called the vestibulocochlear nerves, but one controls hearing, the other controls balance. So one nerve is concerned with that part of the inner ear that gives us our hearing, the other with part of the ear that governs our balance. The vagus nerve, I've already told you, and the vagus nerve has many, many important functions, regulatory functions in the body. So this leads us to a discussion now about the autonomic nervous system. When we think about the functioning of the brain, our consciousness has much to do with voluntary control over the body, with receiving information from the outside and then instructing our body to do certain things, especially for movement, that sort of thing. But you'll realize that most of the functioning of the body, you do not ever have to think about. You don't think about your heart I must make my heart go faster. You don't think, oh, my blood pressure is low, I must make my blood pressure go higher. These are all functions which just happen automatically, or they seem to. In fact, they're very, very carefully controlled. It's just that they are controlled by a part of the nervous system over which we have no conscious oversight. Well, very, very little. We have a little bit, but in some parts of this automatic nervous system, which we call the autonomic nervous system, some parts of the autonomic nervous system we can override. For instance, our breathing is carefully controlled by the midbrain. The midbrain assesses how much carbon dioxide there is in our blood, and it carefully monitors our breathing and raises or lowers our respiration rate in order to keep a constant level of carbon dioxide in our blood. You don't have to think about breathing. You breathe automatically. You breathe it when you go to sleep at night. You breathe automatically, unless there's something very wrong with you, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But you can hold your breath. You can override the autonomic nervous system in some areas, like the breath. But you cannot voluntarily get your gut to speed up or slow down. You cannot instruct your gut peristalsis to go faster or slower. Your sense of appetite. You may be able to resist eating, but your actual sense of appetite, your sense of hunger, that is an instinctual and autonomic nervous system response to the need for food. All of these things, for example, another one is much of our emotional drive comes from that primitive part of the brain called the limbic system. And much of the feelings that arise because of emotion are because of messages sent through the vagus nerve, for example. The physical sensations of anxiety and this sort of thing, those are impulses which are sent through the autonomic nervous system to produce certain results, certain effects in the body that we recognize as being anxiety. So we have very little control over much of the autonomic nervous system. It just proceeds to try to maintain homeostasis, to keep us, keep conditions within optimal levels. There are different ways in which the autonomic nervous system can actually operate. And the first is by sending out motor impulses, which govern things like blood pressure, govern your respiratory rate, and that sort of thing. But the second way in which the autonomic nervous system effects control is by coordinating with the other great control mechanism for the body, which is the endocrine system. The autonomic nervous system can feed in information into the endocrine system and get the endocrine system to behave in a certain way. Again, completely and utterly unconscious. We cannot control our hormone levels by voluntary thought. It's all assessed and responded to unconsciously by the autonomic nervous system. We're going to find that, in fact, many of the nerves of the cranial nerves are involved in the autonomic nervous system. And when we look at the autonomic nervous system, we recognize that there are two parts to it. So let's assess for a minute. In our nervous system, we had central nervous system. The central nervous system consisted of the brain and the spinal cord. Then we had a peripheral nervous system. That is all of the nerves, all of that part of the nervous system in the rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system consisted of many nerves from the spine, which compose a voluntary nervous system. Those are the motor nerves over which we have voluntary control. But then also in the peripheral nervous system, there is this whole other set of nerves, which compose many of them from the cranial nerves, but many of them also independent of the cranial nerves, which compose the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is divided into two parts. The first is called the sympathetic nervous system, and it is quite complex. I'm only going to do it in moderate detail. Remember that it is communicating with areas of the brain, okay, through the spinal cord. But we can actually look at the structure of the sympathetic nervous system in the body. And the first thing we notice with the sympathetic nervous system is there are two long cords. This one on the side is not shown, but this would be duplicated on this side. Here's the spinal cord here, and here running down a huge chain of nerves with small gatherings. These here are called the ganglia. And they are places, those ganglia are places where nerves are communicating with one another. We have, in the sympathetic nervous system, we have nerves leaving the spinal cord. First, let's just think about this. We have nerves running down the spinal cord and up the spinal cord, which are communicating with the sympathetic nervous system. They leave the spinal cord or enter it with short nerves, which intersect with other nerves here in this chain, and then send information to the body. It's like a relay station, right? So we've got all sorts of information, most of it unconscious, being processed, and then instructions being sent out to the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is communicating with the whole of the rest of the body. The examples shown here are just the classic examples. For example, the sympathetic nervous system has an effect on blood vessels. It has an effect on sweat production. It has an effect on your adrenal glands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the sympathetic nervous system is, in general, we regard it as being an activating system. This is a system which often stimulates. It will result in activity where the body's own activity and metabolic rate will jump up, be boosted. It's the sympathetic nervous system that produces fight or flight. The fight or flight response is classically a sympathetic nervous system response. There is another system called the parasympathetic, and you'll notice immediately a lot of its nerves are cranial nerves arising from the brain itself. The parasympathetic nervous system is, in general, a system of calming. And that's what they say is breed and feed. Okay, so this is fight or flight, breed or feed. These are, let me give you the reason why the names are given to it. If you are a zebra running across the African plains with a lion chasing after you, it is the zebra's sympathetic nervous system that has geared the zebra into action. What has happened is that the sympathetic nervous system has released a great boost of nerve impulses. Those nerve impulses, for example, will constrict blood flow, maybe in the periphery, in the face, and direct blood flow to the muscles so that the muscles can be very, very active. That's if you are being chased by a lion across the African plains, you don't need to be digesting your food. So what the sympathetic nervous system does is it inhibits digestion. It stops your gut from operating. it stimulates the release of glucose because your muscles are going to need lots and lots of glucose for activity. It raises your respiratory rate. It raises your heart rate. It throws you into a physiological state where you are very, very active, very, very aware. If you were to look at the eyes, you'd see that the eyes were dilated. Everything is buzzing, so that this organism can either run away or fight for its life. When the lion is gone and the zebra can calm down and it can go and it can stand under a tree and cool off and it can relax, then the parasympathetic nervous system becomes active. And the parasympathetic nervous system, look what it does to the heartbeat. It slows the heartbeat. It stimulates digestion because now everything's peaceful. You've got time. You can afford to do this. You can afford to sit and digest food. You can even start to think maybe if there's a female zebra nearby, you can even start to think maybe of breeding now that you're safe. You're not going to be doing this when you're frightened. Okay. There is a little bit of complication to this though, because the parasympathetic is not entirely calming, nor is the sympathetic entirely stimulatory. And I'll give you this example. When an organism is very, very strongly pushed into fight or flight, one of the things that happens, for example, is that the parasympathetic nervous system promotes voiding both of the bowel and of the bladder. Why? This is true under normal circumstances too. When we are calm and relaxed and everything, then we can void the bladder easily. We can void the bowels easily under conscious control. But when an organism is strongly pushed into fight or flight, it is the parasympathetic nervous system that forces the bladder to void. It forces the bowels to void. Why? Because you don't want to be running around with several pounds of feces in the gut. It's extra weight. Same with the bladder. You don't want extra weight. You want to void the weight, and so that enhances your ability to get away. This issue of sympathetic and parasympathetic interaction becomes a little bit complicated when we talk about sexual activity as well. Because you'll see here that if you look here, the parasympathetic is what stimulates arousal, sexual arousal, for example. But it is the sympathetic that stimulates actual orgasm and ejaculation. So somehow or other, these two got to play into one another, because if you get too much sympathetic activity, it inhibits arousal. Similarly, if you get too much parasympathetic stimulation, it inhibits ejaculation. And this is the source of many problems for human beings, especially, where especially we start to worry about things. We start to consciously try to influence what is happening, what should be happening instinctually. And so what happens during sex, for example, is that the parasympathetic operates almost all the way through until you reach a crucial point, which I often refer to as being the point of no return, where orgasm cannot be voluntarily stopped, for example. And then there's this giant switchover from parasympathetic to sympathetic nervous system activity. And the sympathetic nervous system activity causes ejaculation in the male, orgasm in the female, and ejaculation in the male. And that if we start worrying about things, if you start thinking, oh no, I wonder if this is going to happen, then what happens is the sympathetic nervous system comes into play too early. and that can lead to the problem of losing the erection. Or otherwise, it can also get problems with delayed ejaculation, this sort of thing. The lesson for sex is don't worry about it. These things are carefully designed to work as they should, to work optimally. And the more that you worry about it, the more likely it is that there'll be some problem. So whenever you want to think about sympathetic, parasympathetic activity, always picture that the situation of fight or flight. The reason that the sympathetic is so critically important is if you look at just at this nerve here, this nerve is going here to these glands here of the endocrine system. And these are the adrenal glands. Now, the sympathetic nervous system will stimulate, cause a lot of these effects just on its own. But one of its effects is to cause a huge boost in the amount of hormones released into the body, which stimulate flight or fight. And this is why it is so strongly associated with that condition. Fight or flight, breed and feed. Those are the two rules. So just picture them, and you'll immediately be able to picture what the sympathetic and what the parasympathetic are doing. The only other thing I will get you to notice is that many of the nerves of the parasympathetic are cranial nerves. So that is how the cranial nerves become part of the peripheral nervous system and part of the parasympathetic at the same time. Okay, these are just summary diagrams for you to show you the functions of sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about in the functioning of the physical structuring of the nervous system is, it takes quite a long time, a measurable amount of time, for sensation to move from the periphery of the body, so your fingers, all the way to your spine, and then up to the brain, and then have that be processed by the brain, either consciously or unconsciously, and then have motor impulses sent all the way back out again to cause an effect in the body. And sometimes that is very dangerous. That could be very dangerous, that lag in time. And for most of the time, we adapt to it. We are adapted to the time that it takes. But sometimes it's critically important for an impulse and a result to be very quick and linked together. And so this is many of the things that happen to us unconsciously, we refer to as being reflexes. You stare into a bright light, your eyes reflexly, the iris closes. Go into the dark, reflexly, your iris is open. That is a reflex activity. But what I'm going to tell you about now is called a simple reflex. And it's a way for the nervous system to produce a very rapid motor response from a sensation without any processing by the brain. And so it short circuits the system. Just think about this, have a look here. And here's our spinal cord again. Here's the sensory route there. And here's the motor route here. Now, under normal circumstances, we would receive some information from outside in the body and send information to the brain for processing. The brain would send information back down again, and it would go out through the motor nerve. And maybe it's maybe you're reaching out and you feel through the fingers, you feel that, oh no, I'm close to the stove and I'll move my hand away. That's all the kind of processing which can be done by the brain, and you just think, oh yeah, I mustn't go there, etc. However, what about if you, by accident, put your finger into a flame, into the gas flame, or into a very hot spot where you instantly get a painful instruction that something's happened? without even processing, without any brain processing at all, your arm will move away, and it will do so reflexly. And it does it through a system called a simple reflex. And here's how it works. Here's the afferent nerve there. This is a pain, a heat nerves have picked up that you have accidentally contacted and unconsciously probably contacted something very, very hot. That sends information to the spinal cord, but it's not sent up to the brain for processing. Instead, it goes through a small connecting nerve here and directly connects to a motor nerve, which causes your hand to flick up and to flick away from the source of the heat. That is a simple reflex. Imagine if, for instance, you put your finger into the flame and then you sent the information not across here, but you sent the information all the way up to the brain, and then the brain sent you and it said, oh no, take your finger away. And then you consciously moved your arm away. By that time, you would have severely burned your finger. Instead, this is a simple reflex. It has a small, it's called an interneuron. So you've got a neuron here, sensory neuron there. You've got a motor neuron sending the instruction to contract. And you have a short-circuiting interneuron there, which gives you the simple reflex. As soon as something dangerous occurs, you get a motor response without any processing at all. Okay, so I now want you please to watch these two movies, The Autonomic Nervous System and Learning and Brain Structure. This is required viewing, okay? And next time I'm going to have some extra credit, which I will tell you what you need to do. Please remember that you have another quiz on Friday, and that will constitute your midterm grade, even though it's just a normal test. It's a normal class test. And I will give you more information about that on Wednesday. In addition, we will have a chance for you to meet live with me for asking questions before that quiz. Okay, so set yourselves down and watch these two movies, please. And I'll see you again on Wednesday.